Prime Minister, are you there? Tsun Jin.
Oh, it's nothing. Okay, can you hear me? Can you
Yes,
hear me?
um,
Yep.
yes, we can. But before that, I think it help OC. Please stop sharing screen. Oh, okay, never mind. Cool. Start whenever you're ready.
Okay. If I was living in a village and I was looking at the television, I see all the urban stories about KLCC and KL Tower, I would feel so jealous, right? So let's move on. Let's starting out with the setup. Two pieces of setup here. First piece of setup. Where are these bases of operation gonna be distributed to, right? What locations are they gonna be distributed to? A, it's gonna look like it's distributed to somewhere far away from the cities, the populated areas, and it's gonna be branching out slowly, gradually from the city from the urban areas to these rural areas gradually. And B, it looks like this type of bases is gonna need like electricity or a way to gain these resources in order to function, in order to operate. So they're gonna build near smaller towns rather than extremely rural places, right? And so it will look like when building these places in these smaller towns, with land and enough land and space in order to build the base, which is the suitable place. Second piece of setup. How would these companies be heavily incentivized to do so? A, it will look like the government will be allowing these companies to build these spaces outside of urban centers, and B, there will be specific regulations in place for to let the companies choose the right place to build. Like it will look like finding a place that is able to build without harming the productions or activities of the town, right? And so moving on to our argument here. Our argument here is how this branching out will benefit the development of the country. So what's the status quo now? How does the current countries look like? First, it looks like these countries likely have an urban center where companies already have built their bases there, for example, maybe their headquarters, right? And this means that many of the rural people uh, do urban migration in order to find jobs, in order to feed their families, right? Which also means that these urban areas will become more congested and more packed, right? You already see this in what KL and Singapore, right? And secondly, it means that the country has a lot of rural areas as well because they're all focusing on this one urban area. It looks like these rural areas aren't as developed as the urban areas. For example, maybe it's just an average village or kampong with no like basis of operation or no like factories or malls in there, right? It's a lot of farms. And like this, it happens in Malaysia also. Like you can see the difference between the east coast and the west coast of Peninsular Malaysia. You see like Pahang, and you can see the difference between Pahang and Selangor, right? The Kuantan and Kuala Lumpur is a very big difference, right? And so, what's the problem here, right? We have two problems here. The first problem is that it's hard for these rural people to actually find good jobs in these rural locations, right? Okay, why is that? Because A, the jobs in the rural areas are just quite mediocre to say the least, because they are only like be able to put food on the table, right? Then B, the community in these rural areas is small, right? It looks like these areas where the residents aren't as centralized, maybe they live very far from each other and aren't as connected with each other, so the community is quite small. And everyone isn't rich and just trying to survive. See, the resources of or jobs opportunities in the village are limited, and the most they can do is just probably activities like farming or just working laboring jobs. And D, it's because of this less development in these rural areas, it's gonna be harder for them to get into these urban areas, urban migration as a whole. Why? Why are they gonna struggle? Three reasons why. A is because the transport and the logistics to get there in the first place is expensive. You want an urban migration, you gotta find a house, it's expensive as hell. And B, it's hard to afford living in these urban areas as well. Like I said, housing prices are high, and then like the food is so expensive. Milo ice costs like 5 ringgit now. What? And then C, only a handful amount of rural areas actually get to go to these urban centers because it's quite expensive with that, but they still struggle. They also still struggle when they do this. And so the second problem is, why is it not helping the development of our country? A is because the country likely has a lot of rural areas and undeveloped land, right? And B, most of the resources and job opportunity in these urban areas are not spread evenly throughout the area to these less urban areas or these rural areas as well. And C, it looks like the most of the development in the country is going to happen in one area in the country. For example, like maybe the capital city is the most developed, or maybe or it's just a port off the coast is going to be more developed compared to inland places. And the quality of life is different for the people of in the it's different for everyone in the country depending on where they live. So now moving on to part two, which is that we say by branching out these spaces, we can spread out the luxury and help develop the entire country as a whole. Because when these companies like build in these areas, right, like it look like they're branching out and building in multiple different locations as well. This is true because these companies also do want to have a strategic location in place in order to expand in the future, right? They are very strategic. These companies are very strategic. They want to have a better future planning as well. So they're going to put these spaces in strategic locations. And the second part is that it makes the development of these spaces much easier as well. Like I said, because there's a lot of land, right? It means that there's more flexibility to build whatever you want. Maybe you want to build a big factory or big office space, right? You compare this with urban areas, right? You have such limited space. Everything is so no, and everything is just so packed together now. And so this means that you have more flexibility to do these operations in to do whatever you want and to expand in future operations as well. And third, we provide more job opportunities to the rural people. Now, these spaces also need workers to operate as well, to operate and function as well. So what they will do is they're gonna hire other people from these rural areas and they're gonna provide job opportunities. B is that these people living in rural areas can actually have access to these urban luxuries and a much higher salary, and they're gonna get a much higher salary, right? This is likely because like this is a company from the urban area itself, right? This is a job that is relatively fancy and pays relatively more. And C, these companies are gonna branch out even more because, like I said, they're gonna have strategic locations, right? So they're gonna make more facilities in the area. For example, they're gonna implement like transport systems and all that stuff. And so, what's the impact of this, right? We have one impact here, which is the country will become more developed. Now, let me explain more on this. Now there is no imbalance between the areas now. Now there's equality between both sides, like maybe pay equality or just quality of life equality, right? Like for example, now even like the kampong kids, the village kids can get a good iPhone 17 now. They're gonna be so happy about that, right? And there's going to be more demand for jobs because these people are able to catch up to the current demand of these jobs and pays, and they're going to have financial stability and all that. Uh, and C is that these type of people can finally have access better technology from these urban areas. This because with the gradual relay of like technology and culture from these urban areas, they can actually get this. And E is that these rural towns will become more united and connected with everyone else in the area because of the gradual expansion of the town, and now they can have a better community as a whole. And with that, propose.
Thank you, PM, for that fine speech. It strictly reminds you for teams to only speak until 7:15. Anything past 7:15 will not be taken note by the panel. Without further ado, calling upon Elo. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. So there are two parts to my speech. Firstly, framing. So what do bases of operations look like? They are main locations from which a company conducts its business activities. This can include office, headquarters, or warehouses and distribution centers. But this is excluding factories or manufacturing plants since the motion specifically focused on operational and logistical basis. Secondly, what is heavily incentivized? So governments provide substantial financial or regulatory benefits to encourage companies to establish or relocate these bases away from urban centers. For example, large tax breaks, grants, subsidies, cheaper land, or infrastructure support. The incentive must be strong enough to materially influence where companies choose to operate as per the motion. Thirdly, what are urban centers? So these are major cities and densely populated metropolitan areas where businesses, workers, consumers, and infrastructure are concentrated. So in status quo, companies already choose where to locate offices, warehouses, and distribution centers based on 5 main things. Firstly, operating costs. Secondly, access to workers. Third, customers and suppliers. Fourth, transport infrastructure. Fifth, business networks. Companies naturally choose urban centers where cities provide the most efficient combination of workers, customers, and infrastructure. Some companies already operate away from cities when it's genuinely cheaper or more efficient, such as locating warehouses near major highways. governments can already encourage regional development through infrastructure investment and normal business policies without heavily subsidizing relocation. So, four problems with the status quo. Firstly, urban congestion, high concentrations. This means that high concentrations of businesses and workers contribute to traffic congestion and overcrowding. Secondly, expensive urban operation, rent and land costs is significantly higher in major urban centers, and this is why most companies would choose to move towards more rural centers, even without
Point.
these benefits that the government gives. Third, uneven regional development. Areas outside major cities may receive fewer private sector jobs and investments. Fourth, pressure on infrastructure, which means that concentrated economic activity places greater pressures on roads, public transport, and other urban infrastructure. However, these problems do not prove that forcing businesses away is the best solution. Governments can address them directly through better transport planning and infrastructure. What this means is that we accept that urban concentration creates genuine problems. However, our principle is that businesses should choose locations based on economic efficiency, not government subsidizers. Companies should still be free to move outside urban areas when, for main reasons, land is cheaper, transport is convenient. Third, workers are available, the location generally improves efficiency. The government should instead improve public transportation, upgrade urban infrastructure, manage congestion, direct investment in less developed regions. Heavy incentives will distort the market by encouraging companies to relocate even when the move would not otherwise make economic sense. Though there are three main stakeholders here. First, companies. Companies are the primary target of this policy because they decide where to establish their bases in operation. So in status quo, companies will choose location based on, as I said, 5 reasons: cost, workers, customers, infrastructure, and accessibility. Urban areas are more attractive because they offer large labor pools, strong support networks, and access to customers and supplies. But the problem with their policy is that heavy incentives may cause companies to prioritize subsidizers over genuine business efficiency.
Point.
They relocate to less suitable areas simply because the government pays them to. This matters because inefficient relocation can increase operating costs, reduce competitiveness, and eventually lead to higher prices or fewer jobs. In retrospect of what side government actually said. The second stakeholder here is workers. Workers are directly affected because company locations determine where employment opportunities are available. So in status quo, urban areas center provides public transport, dense housing, many employment opportunities, and easier commuting. But there are still problems with this policy. Moving away businesses away can create longer commutes, higher transportation costs, and greater dependency on cars. So lower income workers are particularly affected if they have fewer transportation options. They matter because workers bear the everyday cost of relocation even though they do not receive the subsidies. So third is the government and taxpayers. Government and taxpayers matter because because heavy incentives requires large amount of public money. In status quo, government can use that public money for public transport, infrastructure, urban planning, and regional development so that we can receive the same benefits as side government. The problem with this policy is that every subsidy creates an opportunity cost. Money given to companies cannot simultaneously be used for better public transport, healthcare, education, infrastructure. Companies may also become dependent on subsidies or leave once these subsidies disappear. They matter because taxpayers ultimately pay for the policy, while the final direct benefit goes to the private companies. This brings me to my first argument, where heavy incentives will distort where the business operates. So, as an explanation, companies should relocate based on cost, workers, customers, and infrastructure. Heavy subsidizers artificially encourages them to move away from cities when staying is more efficient. This is true because urban centers have dense labor markets, transport links, customers, and business networks. Moving away can increase commuting, logistic, and coordination costs. This is likely because companies respond to large financial incentives. If the government offers enough money to qualify as heavy, firms have a reason to choose subsidized location, even if it is not naturally optimal. This has a significant impact because higher operating costs can result into higher prices and lower wages reduced by competitiveness. Businesses may also spend resources relocating instead of improving their products or services. This is sustainable because once company fills offices or warehouse elsewhere, relocation is much more expensive. Inefficient decisions can therefore remain for years even after the original incentive changes. This has a big impact because the policy applies across many industries to offices, warehouses, and distribution centers. The resulting cost can affect workers' consumers and businesses. There are three main impacts here. Firstly, economic efficiency. Subsidized will distort business location decisions. As a result, there will be higher costs, prices, and lower competitiveness. Secondly, worker burden. This relocation means longer commutes and higher transport costs. In result, there will be less accessible jobs, especially for lower income workers within urban areas. Third, wasted public money. Heavy incentives require large taxpayer spending. As a result, less money for public transport, infrastructure, and essential services, which are the benefits that state government will never ever get if they. So this, I'm going to move on to my nuance, where some workers living outside cities benefit from new nearby jobs, but this does not help workers who already live in urban areas and cannot afford to relocate. And this is why I'm proud to propose.
Thank you, Elo, for that very fine speech, calling upon Deputy Prime Minister to extend legal case. Here. DPM, are you there?
Hello, am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Just give me 1 second to organize my things. Right. Opposition only looks at a world where you not only neglect the people living in rural areas, but you also remove the job opportunities, because these rural areas, from these people working in rural areas, have to go to the cities, have to spend so much effort to go to the cities and risk a potential incident happening in the first place. Then, now before getting into the debate, just a few strategies call to side opposition. Then, now on their point of how like these companies will not be able to choose, should not be able to choose, but because this is worse for them, right? We tell you that this is not an active motion, right? Companies will be heavily incentivized and encouraged to distribute to rural areas as well. It's likely that these are government sectors will open spaces to these companies in the first place, and they will give you rewards in the first place, right? It's not a relocation. We just want the distribution of smaller stores into these types of rural areas as well, right? And we aren't asking you to move your entire company, right? We admit that it's not a good decision to just move your entire headquarters there. It's more likely your headquarters is going to branch out to these smaller areas, and therefore it's more likely that you want to build your specific stores there as well, right? So what this motion is about is how it's huge companies branching out of smaller stores and buildings that are not headquarters to rural areas, right? Where these workers living in cities will still choose to work in the city itself, right? The people going to these kinds of rural companies or these type of rural stores are most likely for the people who are living in rural areas themselves. So like, secondly, then, is that even if, why would companies actually do this in the first place? Because of two incentives that they have. Because because you simply just have less competition with the other stores in the areas, right? Such as you can garner a lot of the people from that rural area to come to your store as well to buy your products as well, because they're just a new form of customers, right? And which is second incentive, which is access to different form of customers as well, which also inspires people to go into these specific jobs, because these stores do require workers. These stores do require new forms of customers that they've never seen before. Then they get to enjoy these types of products in the first place. So on what does the opposition's world look like then? It looks like one thing. It looks like they put all of their companies within these urban cities in itself, because this causes two things. Rural communities will have to put so much effort to even get to these places in the first place, e.g. public transportation, having to spend so much money on these specific transportation to be able to pay like IM 2 ringgit to even get to the train, and then IM 2 ringgit again. Now it might seem small at first, but over time, the more times it goes on, the money that is spent on these types of little transportation is not worth the money that the profit that you actually get in these jobs as well, right? These people have a harder time trying to access these jobs in the first place, because it also affects their good performance. Secondly, then, is that the demand that they get in the rural area is going to be less and less, especially when the job there is mediocre, such as farming, such as being able to sell a bak kut teh or something like that. It doesn't actually cater to the younger generation, or it doesn't actually cater to the more specific modern demand that these people are are wanting that this looks like malls, this looks like stalls and festivals, or this looks like office jobs where people are more likely to just go into it because they earn a higher salary, right? Thirdly, then is that people see that it's the current problem today, right? Where right now inflation is getting worse and worse, right? That's exactly why people in rural areas see that they cannot do well in these jobs, and then they are incentivized to move out of their homes to find jobs in the city. Then, but however, during this time as well, they need to be able to afford so many things in order to even get to the job in the first place for this so-called stability, right? And things cannot change in opposition's world because then governments are too scared to actually invest in things that actually need time. Governments are too scared to invest and ask people to actually distribute out to and slowly branch out to just these smaller areas as well. So what is the problem with this? And the problem with this is very simple because number one, it affects the people's performances in their jobs. Why is this true? Because these people have to wait for hours on the bus, they have to wait for hours on the train, having to drive hours to even get to an already well-developed area. And especially in these when cases like when it's heavily raining, when it's heavily when crises happen, they cannot really afford to be able to fix these problems in the first place if the job location is so far away. So on to our extension before going to that, your POI.
So like if you said that they take like such a long time to go to these urban areas, right? So like wouldn't just making the transport better solve this problem instead of having to relocate the entire thing?
Well, exactly, because on our side, then governments are more incentivized to actually improve the transportation system towards more specific areas as well. Why? And here's how we're gonna, okay, here is my argument then. Because why? Because on the extension of how we're able to provide more opportunities for the people, right? What does it actually look like to slowly branch out to these areas, right? And these also answers your POI as well. What does this look like? Number one, it looks like governments are able to have the incentive to slowly integrate things like better housing, better implement those structural transport systems that actually reach out more and more into the people because they have like these companies there now. They have like people actually living there, people actually working there, right? So like these governments are more likely to want to be able to put their money and put their funding into these specific transport systems for not only the rural area to go into the suburban city as well, but for the people living in urban area to actually go to the workplace that they're actually living in near right now, right? Secondly, then is that it has lesser backlash from the rural areas if you actually branch it out slowly, right? Because why? Because these people are more likely able to accept the change if it's slow process where governments are able to allocate resources into specific areas, and that means that they're able to see that there is a specific change going on. That means that they're able to know that hey, if I want to move houses, if I want to get a better job opportunity, I better start planning now. Then after a year or two, people are more likely to accept it. People are more likely to say that hey, I have a better future, I have a better opportunity for this job as a whole. Then so what is the comparative here and what is the development so important, right? Two reasons why this is true. Because A, it's simply more affordable for the people who cannot pay for housing in these urban areas as well, especially when these urban areas are so high in cost, where the rent and living there is like RN 500 or something. Whereas on our side, when governments want to be able to branch out to certain rural areas, it's more likely that these housing companies are going to make their affordability much more better to be able to cater to the demand in the first place, right? It may not be as well developed, it may not be as well luxurious, but it's so much easier and closest to their workplace as well. B then is simply because this economy is so much more stable on their side, right? Where people are able to fully contribute the workforce to be able to improve the economy of the country in the first place. When A is no longer so packed within the areas where these people have to go through trains and suffer like being in crowded areas, like enduring the sweat from my neighbor to be able to get to these places in the first place. Then secondly then is that the growth is more balanced among the country as well, where you do not have just one side having more development and then having the other side where a majority of people living in poverty, living in rural areas are existing, right? The growth is more balanced that way, and it's not just centralized where a majority of the investors will even just go into these areas in the first place. And thirdly then, it's simply better for the company as well, right? Because we have already told you before, they are able to access more different forms of customers and workers as well. It's not that they'll ask the workers living in cities to just move to the rural areas. It's more likely that they're able to get more workers in these rural areas because they're in high demand, which means that these places will more likely to be able to be fully utilized, such as your warehouses, such as your office jobs, because people absolutely need these jobs in the first place. People don't really have to compete with like let's say like really high Ivy League students living in urban cities, right? They can just go to the office jobs in their nearby area to be able to contribute to not only their housing but also towards the core economy as well. And with that, never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, DPM, for a very fine speech. Point yellow. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear, but you have a bit of an echo.
Okay, so am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so there'll be 3 parts in my argument. First, which is the preemptive, second, the rebuttals, and third, the argument. Before that, I'm going to point some very obvious problems. SciGov has contradicted the motion. We are going to branch out to rural areas, but the motion states to set a basis of operations, which means they'll just move the whole operation. SciGov has contradicted themselves. Overinflation exists in urban areas. We totally agree. That is why we should benefit people in urban areas. They also agree that the money should go to better transportation, which is just a total contradiction. Now, I'll restate my first speaker's claim. Companies will move to rural areas if there is a need. Now, I'm going to move on my preemptive first, though. They also might claim this reduced urban congestion. Congestion can be solved directly through the public transport, route planning, and congestion management. We should not pay companies to relocate just to solve a problem with other solutions. They also might claim this creates jobs in rural areas. Jobs are only valuable if the businesses are economically sustainable. Subsidized relocation may create jobs that disappear when incentives end. They might claim companies get cheaper land. Companies already have an incentive to sell cheaper land if the government's them. If they have government incentives, relocation is likely not efficient enough on its own. They also might claim this promotes regional development. The government can invest directly in infrastructure, education, and transport in less developed areas. Giving large subsidies to provide companies is a less targeted solution. Finally, they might claim urban areas are too expensive. High urban costs are the reason for companies to consider alternative locations. The market can naturally encourage relocation when it makes economical sense. Now, time to dish out my rebuttals. Government claims urban areas will become more packed. Why this is not likely? Companies do not automatically need to leave cities for cities to become less crowded. Urban density is driven by housing, population, and transport as well. This is also not sustainable. If some businesses leave, people may still live in cities because of schools, housing services, and other jobs. This has a very small effect. Moving offices or warehouse does not necessarily remove the main source of urban population and congestion. We have an alternative to this. The government can reduce congestion through better public transport, zoning, and infrastructure without forcing the business away. Our guess is that because moving some businesses can reduce certain forms of congestion. But this only happens if companies actually relocate and workers do not simply continue commuting into the city. Our take is that their policy focuses on moving businesses, while the real problem is urban infrastructure and transport capacity. We solve congestion directly instead of distorting business locations. Why do we win this clash? We win this clash because of causation. Removing businesses doesn't equal to automatically reducing urban population. In terms of effectiveness, better transport and planning directly targets congestion. The trade-off to this is that policy risk higher costs and longer worker commutes for an uncertain reduction in urban crowding. The bottom line to this is that we do not deny urban congestion. We prove the solution is inefficient and unnecessary. Gov has also claimed that when headquarters move to a rural area, the area becomes harder to develop. While this is not likely, it's not necessarily true. One company moving does not automatically create roads, public transport, schools, or other infrastructure. Companies may choose locations with existing infrastructure and skilled workers, meaning they are more likely to move to developed suburbs rather than generally underdeveloped rural areas. This is very not unsustainable. If the company is there mainly just because of the subsidies, if it leaves them to incentives disappear. It has a very limited impact. A headquarters creates jobs, but regional development requires many businesses and long-term investment. Our guess is that we concede that some rural areas can benefit from new businesses through jobs and investment. Our take is that the government should develop rural areas first, rather than just paying companies to move there. invest in transport, digital infrastructure, education, and utilities. So companies have a genuine reason to establish bases there. Why do we win this clash? We win this clash because of causation. One company doesn't equal to automatic regional development. In terms of sustainability, government-funded development is more reliable than depending on subsidized companies. In terms of efficiency, infrastructure investment benefits everyone in the region, not just one company. The follow-up to this is that develop the area to attract businesses rather than pay businesses to artificially develop the area. Let me move on to my argument. Relocation makes jobs accessible. Why is that? Moving offices, warehouses, and distribution centers away from cities means workers may need to travel further. Urban areas usually have better public transport and more concentrated housing. This is true because workers cannot easily move their homes just because their workplace moves. Rural or suburban locations may have fewer public transport options. This is likely because companies will relocate when incentives are large enough. Existing employees will have to adapt to the new location. This has a very significant impact. Longer commutes mean more time, higher transport costs, and less work-life balance. Low-income workers are most affected because they have fewer transport choices. This has a very big reach. Every employee of a relocated company can be affected. Workers may face these difficulties for years. The impact to this is that there will be longer commutes. This causes more time spent traveling and worse work-life balance. Higher transport costs to move to of the impact is that it disproportionately hurts lower income workers. They also has less accessible jobs. Jobs become harder to reach, especially for workers without private transport. Few people can realistically access these employment opportunities. My nuance is simple. Some workers outside cities may benefit from new nearby jobs. However, this does not compensate workers who are dependent on urban accessibility. Their best case is that new jobs are created outside cities. Our worst case is that some workers face longer commutes. Their benefit is very uncertain. While the commute burden is an immediate consequence of relocation. Let me wait from you. From direct, workers experience the impact immediately. At a scale, many employees can be affected. In terms of inequality, lower income workers suffer disproportionately. In terms of time, relocation and housing decisions are difficult to reverse. Let me conclude this for you. OP protects workers from being forced to bear the hidden costs of government-subsidized relocation. And this is what I'm proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Operations, for a very fine speech. Following Gulf Whip to end the Gulf portion of this attempt is here.
Hi. Okay. Just a stand. Okay. Wait. I beg guys. The things. Okay. This is not an active motion. We are not trying to get companies to even we're not trying to make companies' lives better. But even if so, I don't even know what benefit you give. We give you a larger scale benefit. It's about how the country can develop, and they completely say this is not likely. The companies are more important here. I do not understand. So before that, two clarifications here. First clarification. Government said about how we contradict about onto our setup about how these are usually in rural areas, and it is proof of it because of how it's less likely. I'll explain to you why again, even though my first speaker already explained to you, right? Because firstly, when we build bases outside of urban center, you most likely want to choose to build in places that most likely have electricity, land, people, and resources. And what kind of places usually have these type of things to offer you? Usually in places where they have smaller towns, or usually what we call rural areas. It's only in this kind of areas where they have people and resources and electricity where these companies want to build. Why would they want to build somewhere in the middle of the jungle or on top of the mountain? That's not what we're trying to say here, right? And then secondly, we are not trying to relocate businesses as a whole, like relocating their HQ by like both of my speakers already told you, right? We are more likely trying to tell them to branch out their things. This looks like branching out their warehouses, branching out their distribution centers out into other places. This does not look like I'm moving my workers into like Penang, or I'm moving my workers into like Kedah or something. It's not how it works, right? It's more of us like actually telling them to put the branches instead of putting the branches inside KL, inside the center, we tell you to put the branches inside other places that are much more rural and things like this. And this does not mean we're moving workers too, right? Most likely we are able to like be more efficient and tell the people the rural areas and make them our workers instead of just moving workers as a whole. It doesn't really make sense. Okay, now let's look at the main question, right? The main question is a little bit parallel, but I think but actually, it's more about which side provides a better development and provide a better job opportunity as a whole towards like everyone as a whole, right? Put your hands down first. Okay, so now they tell you how companies should have efficiency on their side when in terms of choosing locations, and they say that how we have a lot of harms because of the companies having a lot of harms and moving workers and things like this, right? One response: this is not really true for 3 reasons here. Firstly, the companies that want to branch out or have the ability to are usually really large companies that can literally afford to build all these buildings in the first place. Secondly, this means that they have the money to be able to pay for such funds and costs in the first place, right? The harm, even though they had to pay a hefty amount of money, they are still be able to afford it. It won't be so bad to the point that the company goes bankrupt. It won't be so bad to the point that they have to change workers and things like this. No, they are still able to afford it. They are big companies who wants to branch out. That's why they were willing to do it. And thirdly, the companies will still use money and still build companies will still have the incentive to build all of these different branches and still use all of their money. Why? Because these type of companies need these type of branches to earn even much more money. They need to spread their branches. They need to build more warehouses to make their companies much more larger. That's why they are more willing to be able to have the incentive to actually want to listen to the government's regulations, listen to the government's rules, and actually make this kind of changes to branch out into other areas instead. Before I move on to the second thing, yes, BYM me.
The motion literally is that. Wait, sorry, there's an echo. Okay. The motion is literally to that set up basis of operation away from urban centers. This means that you cannot branch out. You have to set your whole base of operation there.
No, it says you branch out bases of operation. You literally read it yourself. Like branch out bases of operations, like branching out warehouses. Like if my HQ is like if like Junbin HQ is here, Junbin site distribution, like Junbin restaurant doesn't have to be next to me the whole time, right? You don't see like Maxis building their HQ inside like next to like all their different branches and small things, right? It's like literally a different area here. Just live life. Okay, so B, even if this is really true and like seriously their workers, like the company doesn't really get us a lot of harm and the company gets more efficiency on their side, we say that we have a larger benefit on the outside here, right? Because this is not an active motion. We say that the fact we benefit the development of the country and benefit the people in rural areas of them actually being able to have jobs is a much larger impact in proximity here. That's why you should most likely take this argument here, right? Because firstly, companies building bases are able to develop, let's say, rural area, right? This was like building more facilities in the area for their workers to stay in. This was like developing the transportation of the transportation between the rural areas, between the urban center too, because they had the incentive to make this easier for them. They had the incentive to make efficiency, and most likely they will have the incentive to develop these kind of things because the government tells them to, and they have no choice too, right? And secondly, we are able to provide more job opportunity to these rural areas. This I want to highlight because this is really important here. Because the problem right now in many countries is that a lot of people are literally going to urban centers, right? Literally migrating to urban centers because all of these rural areas don't have the luxury of having this. We still see people actually eating nasi lemak every day instead of actually just like having a better jobs or having a better living of life inside, especially in Malaysia too, right? It's important for them to be able to access this kind of luxury that they have in urban centers, right? Maybe in these companies will most likely have jobs that will be able to pay you with higher salaries because these companies are larger companies that are able to provide this kind of salaries for you, and this type of people in rural places will be able to access these kind of things. My second speaker already tell you how these type of jobs will be much more better for them. They can be able to access these products. They can be able to access all of these things. That's much more important for us here to have this job opportunities here. And thirdly, how we develop the entire and thirdly, why is this the only solution we have in the difference, like in the problem of development of the country? Why on their side they literally cannot do it, right? Because number one, we tell you on how focusing on the transportation, the development of the transportation does not solve the problem when we tell it, and it does not solve the problem. Just tell you how. Because like because even if transportation still able to be built, right, this urban center still really have really expensive housing where these people in rural places will still definitely struggle to earn money, will still definitely struggle to find a house to live, or still definitely struggle to find a really good job. It's harder for them to develop, as literally not fair that people being born in urban centers just have a better quality of life rather than people being born in rural areas where they can't access this kind of things at all. And secondly, we also tell you how even if you have transportation, right, it's still very hard. Like even you look at status quo, like transportation is not available in the entirety of Malaysia. Why is this true? Because like literally it's really expensive and it takes a long time. The government doesn't have incentive to do so. So why do we say we say that you must do it within companies and you must let them branch out these warehouses? Because we say that we cannot develop these areas separately without branching these companies as a whole, right? Because you cannot just suddenly go here and say, I'm gonna start building a mall in Kedah. I'm gonna start building like a bunch of start building more factories inside these type of places. Because the thing is, we're trying to make every single place much more balanced, and we're trying to make every single place have this luxury. And we think this is much more important, right? It's only through companies branching out their warehouses where they let these people have their jobs, where they are able to build more facilities, and when they're able to develop even more, makes it much more better, right? This looks like the companies can also branch out to the other states of the country where the development of the whole country does not only rely on this specific state or this specific urban center. Now it relies on the whole entirety of the country, right? Maybe one state will become much more better because this land is much more better and this land is much more cheaper, where you have a lot of different branches and bases inside of there. And this state will be able to be on par of the current urban center here. And you say this is really important because we want a country where every single place has the right amount of development, and where every single place is just to have the same amount of quality of life. Never have I been prouder to propose. Thank you. Tsun Jin.
Thank you, Godfrey, for that fine speech. To end the substantive portion of the debate, calling all the here.
Audible?
Loud and clear.
Okay, let me take a second to find my thing. Okay, so I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so Judge, I want to call out one thing. So, okay, first, I'll restate the motion first. This House would heavily incentive companies to set a base of operations away from urban centers. Notice that it's setting a base of operations, not branching it out. I have no idea why side government keeps saying branching out. Okay, now I'm going to say rebuttals. When companies move, they claim that when companies move, we move to rural areas that have more land, sufficient population, and has basic necessities. Why is this not true? It's not necessarily true because having land and basic necessities does not guarantee enough skilled workers, transport links, or business networks. And it's not likely because companies, they still prioritize locations that minimize the cost and maximize access to workers and customers. Many rural areas lack all these advantages. And it's also not sustainable because if the location it remains less efficient, companies may become dependent on subsidized to stay there. And the trade-off, the more developed and accessible the rural area is, the more likely companies can already operate there without heavy incentives. Our gift is that we concede that some rural areas can satisfy these conditions and benefit from relocations. We are not arguing that every rural area is unsuitable. Our take is that the debate is whether we should heavily incentive relocation, not whether rural areas can ever work. If a rural area has already sufficient land, population, and necessities, the companies can choose it naturally without massive government subsidies. In this class, it's about companies moving to well-developed rural areas and create jobs. Our response is if these areas are genuinely efficient, high incentives are unnecessary. If they are not efficient, subsidize only hides the underlying disadvantages rather than solving them. Our bottom line to this is that either rural areas are attractive enough to attract businesses naturally, or heavy subsidies are needed to compensate for inefficiencies. Okay, so there's also a clash here. The clash is, does moving businesses actually create a better economy development? So gov cases is that heavily incentives more companies away from urban centers. This means that reduce urban congestions, bring jobs and investment to rural areas, use available rural land, and encourages regional development. Our case is that companies should move only when it's naturally inefficient. Heavily incentives distort businesses decisions and waste public money. Relocation can increase the cost, create a longer commute for workers, fail to create sustainable rural development, and divert taxpayers' money to better solutions. Why do we need this clash? Gov focuses on moving businesses, or we focus on whether moving actually solves the underlying problems. A company relocating does not automatically mean that the surrounding area become developed or urban congestion disappears. We provide a direct solution, improve transport, infrastructure, and regional development instead of subsidizing location. Why is our case more likely than theirs? Gov focuses on moving businesses. We focus on whether moving them actually solves the underlying problems. A company relocating does not automatically mean the surrounding area become developed or congestion disappears. Why is our case more suitable than theirs? Companies, they make decisions based on long-term economy viability, not temporarily subsidized. Government can continuously invest in infrastructure and public transports. We avoid creating businesses that depend on government incentives to remain outside cities. Why do we have a bigger impact than them? Economy. In economy, we avoid higher operating and logistic costs. On a worker, we avoid longer commutes and higher transport costs. For taxpayers, we avoid wasting large amounts of public money. And in the long term, infrastructure investment benefits entire communities, while subsidized mainly benefits selected companies. Our bottom line is that government moves businesses and hopes development follows. We create the conditions for development first, allowing businesses to move naturally when it actually makes sense. Gov's case is that move companies to rural areas to create jobs, investment, and economy activities. This supposedly improves rural residents' income, infrastructure, and quality of life. And our case is that improving rural quality of life directly rather than relying on companies to move there. Government, they should invest in public transports, healthcare and education, roads and digital infrastructures, and local businesses and services. Companies should relocate only when the area is genuinely efficient for them. Why do we win in this clash? A company does not mean a developed community. One company may create jobs, but it does not guarantee better healthcare, transport, education, or public services. We directly target the things that determine quality of life, while Gov relies on indirect effects. Why is our case more likely than them? Companies may not choose rural areas if they lack skilled workers, transport, or business networks. Government invests directly provides the infrastructure and service rural resident needs. Therefore, our benefits do not depend on companies finding relocation profitable. Why is our case more suitable than them? Infrastructure and public services provide long-term benefits to the entire community. Companies may leave when subsidies disappear or when operating costs become too high. Our model does not make rural development depend on private companies staying. Why do we have a bigger impact than them? Gov's impact is mainly creating some jobs and economy activities. Our impacts is that we improve multiple dimensions of life: healthcare, education, transport, connectivity, and employment. Our benefit reaches the whole rural population, not just people employed by the relocation company. Our bottom line to this is that government brings companies and hope quality of life improves. We improve the condition of rural communities directly, making development border more reliable and sustainable. By illustration, I'll give you guys a quick illustration. Imagine a government give a company a huge subsidy to move its headquarters to a rural town. The company arrives, but the town still has poor roads, limited public transport, fewer skilled workers, and weak infrastructure. The company may create some jobs, but this does not automatically develop the entire town. If the subsidy ends, the company may leave because the location is still less attractive than the city. Therefore, one company moving does not equal to sustainable rural development. And this is why I'm proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opie, for the very fine speech, beginning the reply session debate. Calling of reply. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you. So, beginning my speech in 3, tourism. So there are four main claims that side government has made that are not likely, their impact is too small, and their trade-off is too small. So the first government claim they made was that moving companies improve the rural quality of life. So they never prove why it's likely. They assume company relocation automatically creates development. They never prove companies will actually choose rural areas with enough workers, transport, and infrastructure. Even if company moves, they never prove they will stay long term. Their impact is also very small. A relocated company mainly creates jobs and spending. It does not automatically improve healthcare, education, public transport, or basic infrastructure. Benefits are concentrated among employees and nearby businesses rather than the whole rural population. Their trade-off is also way too small. They ignore the cost of heavy incentives paid by taxpayers. Companies may face higher operating costs, which can lead to higher prices or fewer jobs. Workers may face longer commutes and higher transportation costs. The same government money could directly improve rural infrastructure and services. The bottom line to this is that they prove companies can bring some economic activity, but not that this is most likely, largely, or most sustainable way to improve rural quality of life. The second government claim was that moving companies reduces urban congestion. It is not likely because they assume removing some businesses will significantly reduce congestion. They never prove that workers and customers will stop traveling into urban centers. Congestion is also caused by housing, schools, public transport, and population density. Their impact is small because moving offices and warehouse does not remove the majority of urban residents. Some congestion may decrease, but cities will still face significant traffic and infrastructural pressure. The trade-off is so way too small. Relocation can create longer commutes for workers. More distant warehouses may increase delivery and transportation costs. Government must spend heavily on incentives instead of improving public transport and urban infrastructure. Side government has also claimed that this will create more jobs in rural areas. They never prove why it is even likely. They don't prove existing companies will create many new jobs rather than simply relocate existing ones. Some company may automate warehouses or offices instead of hiring more workers. The impact is also really small. A single company creates a limited number of jobs compared with the entire rural population. Jobs don't automatically improve other aspects of quality of life. The trade-off is also way too small. Existing workers may face longer commute. Subsidies may cost taxpayers more than the economic benefits created. If the companies leave after the incentives ends, the jobs may just straight up disappear. Side government has also claimed that this, in their word, they will encourage regional development, but they have never ever proved why it is likely, because they assume one company will trigger a widespread development within the rural area, but they don't prove other businesses will follow. And when other businesses don't follow, it means that there's only one company in that rural area. There won't be a much significant impact. The impact is also really small because development around one company is extremely limited and concentrated. It does not guarantee anything that can actually straight up lead to an improvement in quality of life, such as better education, better schools, better infrastructure, better healthcare, or better public transport, which can solve all the current problems that side government cannot. Their trade-off is also way too small. The government spends large amounts to create uncertain spillover effects. So this means that direct investment in infrastructure and public services could benefit the whole region instead. So I'm going to once again call out their entire misunderstanding of the whole motion. So the motion states that it is literally just setting up their basis of operation, not branching out to them. And I had to say this again. So this is why I'm proud to oppose.
Thank you, Om reply, for that fine speech. Point Gov reply. Here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Right. Timer.
If I think.
No, I mean, yeah, timer.
Right.
Good luck.
Judge, straight off the bat, let's get this very straight. This has become a definition debate between what exactly basis of operation is, right? Which is exactly why we'll tell you today, even if we do take the opposition's definition, why we still win in this debate then. So what is the question that needed to be answered in this debate? Is number one, on our side, on how we are able to ensure good development on our side, right? So a few reasons why we win and a few reasons why they lose, Judge. So number one, on the most crucial thing is they fail to actually understand exactly what in this context of the motion, what these bases actually are, right? The example given are offices, warehouses, distribution centers. This looks like places where we actually put like those huge boxes in warehouses where they distribute out to like certain environments in the first place. Right? Places that are smaller in health. Yes, sorry. Anyway, places that are smaller in branches and not exactly the headquarters as well. It's not always the headquarters and there's no reason for them to actually go into these places in the first place. And now, even if it's true, then we've already proven to you on why these companies won't be as harmed or won't be as affected as they try to tell you, right? But because A, they probably already have the enough money or the other cost to go to other areas in the first place, and they probably already thought of a long time until they have wanting to take this decision from the government to be able to be able to like set up it in the rural area in the first place, right? So if it really does harm the company, then the company does have a choice to just not go in the first place, right? Because it's heavily incentivized. They're not forced to go there. You don't get the punishment for it. Now, the B then is that these companies will have less competition with other areas as well, which means that there are more job opportunities for the people living there as well, right? Second call then is that they should have argued about how government would have taken too much time because of certain environmental harms, right? But even let's say even if they did run that argument in the scenario where they did, right? But why we tell you why we still win, because number one, it's a worthy investment for the government to actually fund into these rural areas, to actually branch out into rural areas, because it's simply able to not let the rural area people be left behind, right? It's simply because number second, even if they're able to even out the economic imbalance in these areas wholly, so people don't always have to have a large gap in the welfare system between let's say the major cities and the rural areas as well. Third call then is that opposition only gives us a case saying how these companies will be harmed in the first place. They don't exactly tell us a solution on how they're going to solve the problem of these people having lesser jobs, how these people are going to suffer as a result of these people moving on to the rural areas as well, right? My rip already tells you on how already mitigated on how these companies are gonna be affected in the first place, because number one, they already have the funds already. They're able to maintain themselves to a certain extent. Then, so what is the clashes to this debate when it's very clear that it's a definition debate, but still there's going to be clashes? Then who gets a better opportunity and operation, right? What does opposition tell you? Opposition focuses their entire argument on relocation. Then now, even if we do, let's say, be charitable and take their side of the definition, we still get the benefits that we tell you. Then why? Because number one, rural areas will still get more job opportunities from these headquarters as well, because they're not only able to access these places as well, they don't always have to go to the cities. They don't always have to move away so long to be able to access this. They can just maybe drive a few 30 minutes until they get to their workplace, right? So governments not only then will also fund more into the improving of the transport and being able to improve the welfare of the people living in these rural areas as a whole. Then, so second thing then, on the clashes on the government side, then what do we tell you? On our definition, we tell you that these people are able to set up smaller bases in these types of rural areas. Because what does this mean? This means that these governments are willing to use up resources to help things improve there. This so rural areas don't have to constantly worrying about every morning they have to wake up early 6:30 a.m. to go to their development, to go to their jobs in the urban city. Secondly, then is that governments are, as stated before, are more likely to just improve certain systems in itself in the rural area to be able to branch into these urban cities as well, which is the main stakeholder of this debate. It's not mainly about the companies, but mainly also about the stakeholder, the poor people living in rural areas as well, the people living in these urban cities as well. And for all those reasons, please go for it, Gov.
Thank you, Gav's reply, for that very fine speech that ends the debate. Judges, take a second and submit your ballots, and then give me the FBS on WhatsApp. Thank you so much, guys.